look at the professional review process. Just a few bits of housekeeping. We will be recording the session. You would have seen it's just started. And again, this will be available more widely in a couple of weeks after the virtual volunteer conference. Again, if you have just joined us, you are welcome to ask questions using the chat. If you look for the chat icon, there'll be a speech bubble. Should hopefully say chat underneath it as well. If you click on that, you'll be able to see comments and questions from everyone. And I'll be pausing periodically to have a look at the chat, and then we'll have some time at the end as well. In terms of timing, we're aiming to go through the professional review process, the application routes, over the next 45 minutes or so, and that of course includes question time as well. But I'll jump into some introductions and then hand over to Steve Corner as well. So just in terms of my own background, my name is Donovan. I've been with the institution as a member of staff for 10 years. Tongue-tied, shocked by how long that's actually been. So 10 years in September. And for the first 7 years of my time, I worked very closely with the Professional Review Committee and, of course, the Professional Review volunteers, who we'll be talking about quite a lot over the next 45 minutes. And, you know, with training, development, and a lot of good stuff happening there. So something that's very close to my heart. And certainly when I started putting the session together, the knowledge all came back alarmingly quickly. I thought I'd forgotten a lot of it, but clearly not. And I also see some very familiar people in the chat. So we've got some assessors, we've got some interviewers, we've got a couple of facilitators as well. So welcome everyone as we go through this. So that's my background, but I'm going to hand over to somebody who, as I said, I've worked alongside for many, many years. He's a member of the Professional Review Committee. He's the Deputy Chair for IMechE. We'll explain what that means a little bit later on, but won't steal any more thunder. Steve, over to you if you want to tell everyone a little bit about yourself and background, please.
Thanks, Donovan. Yeah, sure. I'm Steve Corner, as Donovan correctly says. I sit on the PRC, currently the Vice Chair for IMechE. By background, I'm something of a generalist, really. I started off in the heavy electrical industry, did stints in the steel and the water industries, and for the last 14 years, I've worked for the compressed gases industry, medical oxygen, that kind of thing. So been around a bit, seen a little bit of industry. For IMechE purposes, I've sat on the Professional Review Committee now for, I think it's 10 years, maybe 11 years, doing various roles. Most recently, the IMechE Vice Chair role. So I've got a reasonably good insight into the processes and the way things get done by the PRC. So hopefully I can help out and add a bit of colour as and when Donovan requires it. So thanks, Donovan. Back to you.
Excellent, thank you, Steve. So yes, very much my knowledge is very much process-based. Again, I've been involved in training, but Steve is very much here to represent that very authentic volunteer experience, having lived it himself, and hopefully give you some insight into what happens behind the curtain within that process. So what I'm going to do is give a little bit of background into all the different routes towards registration, but firstly, an overview of the qualification and membership board. So if you've been at some of the earlier sessions in the conference, yesterday we looked at the overall structure of boards, governance, operational across the institution, and there are a few hundred. If we go down to regional level, young member panels, international, etc., it's a wealth of diversity and good stuff happening. But under all those operational boards is a very important one, which is, of course, the qualification and membership board. And what they're responsible for is this massive engine of looking after all of the processes related to professional review and interview and achieving registration and the activities that support that as well. And it's all, of course, led by licensing requirements from the Engineering Council. And of course, they are the guardians of UK spec as well. And I'll get into a little bit more of that later. But starting, and what we'll be focusing quite a lot today, is, of course, the Professional Review Committee, sometimes called the Professional Registrations Committee. And that's quite a large group, 25 pure committee members, and then, of course, supported by a panel, and then again by a group of dedicated IMechE assessors as well. And we'll get into them, and of course the interviewers that underpin and support that. But another very important one, I'll get into more detail on what they do, is the Academic Standards Committee. They are responsible for university accreditation, and we currently accredit 70 universities across the world. Majority of them are in the UK, but some are international. And these are degrees that are, of course, accredited to either IMechE or CMechE level. And I will leave it at that. It's a lot of complex work that goes into that. And we have academics from universities, of course, industrialists as well involved in that. What I will spend more time on, and they have their own dedicated slide, is the Academic Assessment Committee. And the academics, I think, are an area that people get very, very interested in. They are complex, and there are some assumptions made, I think, about how somebody reaches a point where they are able to apply within the license requirements, the rules and regulations that we have of the entry levels for the different types of registration, which is, of course, engineering technician, incorporated engineer, and chartered engineer. So I will touch on what they do in a little bit more detail. Also look at the Professional Development Standards Committee and what they do. You'll be more familiar with MPDS, Monitored Professional Development Schemes. And they're the committee who accredit those and working with companies across the UK, and again, a few internationally as well. I think the furthest flung one we have is in Trinidad and Tobago. We pop out there every 3 years or so to reaccredit. And then alongside that is the Integrated Schemes Accreditation Committee. And what they do is look after approved route for EngTech, and I'll get more into that a little bit later. Arbitration panel, it is completely independent. And again, they are there to ensure safeguards for the professional review process. And a very exciting committee. We always sort of flinch slightly when we see the word audit, but very, very important for all of this activity going on is the audit committee for the QMB, who is a dedicated group of volunteers who audit the processes and everything involved in it. And then, of course, continuing professional development assessment committee. We had a session about that last night and what they do. Endpoint Assessment Standards Committee, and of course we are now as an institution an endpoint assessor. And then finally the Ethical Principles Committee, and that looks after things like code of conduct and some very interesting things around that. But certainly what we'll be concentrating on today are those top ones that we see, like the Professional Review Committee, Academic Standards, touching on arbitration, and a few others as well. So I'll do a whistle stop through these, and then of course we'll get into more interesting stuff, and I'll bring Steve in to sort of talk about, you know, the hows, the whys, and the experience as well. But this is very much foundational, sort of, you know, the backdrop to what's happening and how everything functions. So if we dive into those academics very briefly, we've got academic requirements for incorporated and chartered engineers. And I think the takeaway from this is, I mentioned the Academic Standards Committee, and they, of course, accredit degree accreditations. If somebody does have an accredited degree, meets the requirement, they go through, they demonstrate competence at interview, and we'll get more into that. However, I think almost 50% of applicants don't meet those requirements. They don't have an accredited degree because there's so many different things happening, so many different ways that people come into engineering, paths that they follow, apprenticeships, all of these very interesting things that don't require or they're not able to achieve a university education. And we don't close our doors to those people. And this is where the Academic Assessment Committee becomes very, very important, because there are three main routes that you can see there on the left-hand side, where people can individually demonstrate how they do meet those, what are referred to as the underpinning knowledge and understanding that is needed. And when we come to UK Spec, it is a two-pronged assessment process, and one of which is this, the academic foundation, that underpinning knowledge, and then of course the competence, and that's the experience gained. And that's what happens at the interview process and the various other assessments that we do. It's looking at those 5 areas of UK Spec, A and B, of course, looking at technical, C, D, and E, the non-technical, communication, leadership, and commitment to engineering. And that's about as much as I'll say about UK Spec, you may be glad to know. But certainly the underpinning knowledge is a separate matter. And we've got all these things happening. Academic review is somebody who perhaps didn't get an accredited degree, went to a university, went to an international university perhaps, and they present degree information, course content, etc. And members of the Academic Assessment Committee, who are, again, specialized volunteers, they have academic backgrounds, they know their stuff inside out and back to front. And they, again, work in pairs and work as groups to look at those individual applications to ascertain that they do meet the academic requirements before signing them off. And of course, they can then proceed to demonstrate competence. Further learning is something slightly different, where somebody looks ahead and goes, right, what do I need to do over the next 2, 3, possibly more years to achieve that underpinning knowledge? And certainly for somebody who is embarking, on a path, they might join a company, might become involved with MPDS, perhaps do an accredited program like that to help them develop that competence. Further learning goes alongside that, and it's producing a very rigorous plan that, again, members of the Academic Assessment Committee would look at and to say, yes, these activities will meet the learning requirements as you do them. And of course, there has to be assessment in that. There have to be people involved who can prove that the learning has been undertaken, etc. So again, very rigorous. And then finally, probably the most difficult one is Career Learning Assessment, CLA. And that one is, as the name may suggest, somebody coming forward who may have absolutely no formal education as we know it. They haven't gone to university either to get bachelor's, undergrad, postgrad, whatever it might be. But over the course of their career, be it 10 years or more, and again, we don't like to be time bound, but again, we are typically looking at 10 or so years or more, through their activities and their work, they have actually not only gained competence, and of course that gets assessed at interview, but they have developed sufficient underpinning knowledge and understanding. And that in and of itself is a separate and probably more rigorous process to go through than the PRI, actually, the professional review interview, because there's a lot of back and forth often between the assessors on the committee and the applicant to say, we want more information, we need to find out more, tell us more about this area. And it's 6 different areas that they look at in that application process, a lot of information to ascertain that this person actually meets the requirements. So again, across those 3 categories, academic review, further learning, and CLA, I'd say almost 50% of applicants go through that to, again, reach that point where they're then able to apply. So something to keep in mind, and certainly what we say to assessors, the people who are doing the competence assessment, is not to worry about this. It's been assessed. We have the Academic Assessment Committee there. They do a very good job. So once they get to the point of interview, focus is purely on that competence, and of course, going back to UK spec. So if we jump then into accredited and approved schemes, and accredited and approved, sometimes interchangeable, and certainly when we collaborate on these things with other PIs, and of course we do when it comes to professional development, initial and continuous, and of course initial being gained before registration, continuing professional development, of course, good old CPD after, essentially the same thing. But we do collaborate with other institutions to look at how we do it. The terms are interchangeable, but the IMechE accredited is for the Professional Development Standards Committee, and that looks after the IMechE and CEng routes, which is of course our gold standard MPDS, Monitored Professional Development Scheme. And then approved schemes are looked after by the Integrated Scheme Accreditation Committee. I know all of these as acronyms. We love an acronym, so of course I know them as PDSC, ISAC, etc. But no, so they look after the technician routes for EngTech, and again, both of them, however, the common thread is assessors from those groups will work with the companies to ascertain that the learning programs they have, the development paths, are appropriate and meet the required standards in order to meet the requirements for, in the case of MPDS, we've got mentors involved looking after people over typically a 4-year period to develop their competence. And again, we've got the approved route scheme, which means that at the end of that process, we know that that rigor has been met before they go through the assessment process. But certainly everyone still goes through that assessment process. But again, a lot of that, I'd say the sort of funnel, the pipeline towards registration comes from these 2 routes. So a lot of activity there by these 2 different committees. Finally, just looking at some of those paths that we've got. As I said, we've mentioned at the top there the approved route for EngTech, We also have the traditional route, which some of you may have come through, and that is going to our website, or years ago, of course, printing out, filling out. Now we do it online, filling out the application, listing out your career path, how you meet each of the competences, your commitment to engineering, some CPD, and you submit that. And again, majority of our applications still come through this route, but still those accredited schemes from MPDS, the approved route. One that is perhaps shrouded in mystery, and I'm probably going to bounce over to Steve in a minute, just to talk a little bit more about armed forces, because again, it's a large source of our registrants from the different arms, REME, the MOD, RAF, Navy. All these different routes have special application processes in place, purely through the fact that, again, we've gone in, we've worked with them and assessed that they have such rigorous rank-related development for their engineers that, again, we can make certain assumptions about the competence that they've developed. And again, that application form will look quite different. We'll have assessors from the armed forces as well to assess them at the point of interview as well. But I'll hand over to Steve, actually, if you want to say anything else about the armed forces, because I know there's sometimes a hesitancy from the outsider who thinks that it might be sort of a mysterious or shrouded route towards registration.
And I can see why that might be, Donovan. But effectively, what we're able to do with the armed forces, and I see we have Christian Sloan-Murphy on as well. We'll be able to talk in detail about the Fleet Air Arm schemes that they have. But just in outline terms, effectively, we're able to map the technical personnel within the Air Force, the Army, the Royal Navy, so that we know that when they reach certain career points within their technical career, they automatically meet the requirements for effectively engineering council criteria. For example, to take EngTech with the Royal Air Force, for example, we know that anyone who reaches a certain rank, and it's kind of senior aircraftsman technician level, then they've done all of the technical training required in order to become EngTech member. So we have a scheme involved where the Air Force can do the checking of that. It's an NVQ level 3 qualification. So effectively they list their rank, their career history. They go through an accredited sponsorship checking process to ensure that an appropriate sponsor, etc., has been found, and effectively they make their application on that basis. For an EngTech qualification, we can then avoid going to interview. Effectively, we can do that application direct through PRC, knowing that all the criteria are already met. It becomes a little more complex with iEng and CEng levels because, of course, the Engineering Council requirement is that people have to undergo a PRI, kind of a peer review. So it isn't quite as simple for those grades of membership, but nonetheless they're included. So perhaps Christian would like to say a few words on that as well.
Christian can't, unfortunately, as
of course he'll be muted, won't he?
He is muted, but certainly I think he's just provided some comments on there. So importantly for iEng and CEng, everyone gets the same interview. That is very, 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 very true. The Armed Forces route just aligns qualifications and allows a slightly shorter application form. Indeed. So again, the application form will be different. The assessors, again, will be from that background, which also helps with things like confidentiality and being able to share information with the panel. But the PRI is still 45 minutes to an hour, panel of 2. They look at all areas of competence. So again, you've still got that thoroughness in process there, which we look for. So thank you, Christian and Steve, for that insight. Just before we move on, I'm going to touch on 2 much more narrow specialized routes, but just to mention them for totality. First is existing registrants. We have members who are, I'm sure you've met some, who are members of not just the Institution of Mechanical Engineers, but perhaps the IET, the ICE, IMRS. There's quite a lot of commonality there. And of course, that's absolutely fine. But what those people will do, if they have gone through the professional review process and interview with another institution, professional engineering institution, they can complete a paper-based assessment to transfer over. And what we look at in those cases are their commitment to CPD that they've done since they first went through PRI, what they've done since, and we also look at for mechanical elements within their technical side as well, because of course we are the IMechE. So again, it's a paper-based assessment that happens for all grades of registration. And then finally, the mutual recognition agreements. You may not have even heard of these, but we do have them with Engineers Australia. You may have seen an article recently, we renewed our agreement with them, and with HKIE, Hong Kong Institution of Engineers. And I think until more recently, but it got combined, was also Engineers Ireland. And what this means is, again, somebody who has been through the professional review process with them, we recognize their rigor, it's been mapped, we're very happy to accept them through that paper-based assessment as well. But again, all goes through the assessors. And again, literally a handful come through every year, but the majority, those, I think we looked at the annual report, it was over 2,800. Just sort of pause for that, sort of 2,800 applications for registration came through over the course of 2021, which is a phenomenal amount. And those will, of course, come from the traditional route, the accredited schemes, armed forces, and the approved route. So quite a lot of industry there. And that's where we get to looking at those assessors. And I'll run through them very briefly, and then, of course, get Steve's input as well. But literally hundreds of, and again, we've got that massive number of almost 3,000 reviews being done. We need hundreds of assessors to do that job. And we have overall, we have about 700 professional review interviewers. And within that whole context and fitting them in order, we start with the professional review committee. We have about 25 committee members, of which Steve is one. We have a chair. We have several deputy chairs, one for each of the categories of registration. So Steve is the deputy for EngTech. We have another for iEng. We have two for CEng, because again, we are as an institution quite CEng heavy in our registrants. We are very much trying to change that. We are very open to encouraging, especially engineering technicians as well. But again, the bulk of applications are coming from CEng, and you'll see why we need two to help with that workload. And then, of course, one for fellows as well. That making up the committee of 25 or so. And again, specialisms as well across that committee. We've got people from the armed forces, academia, different industries as well for their wealth of experience there. And they meet quarterly throughout the year. But supporting them and doing just as much good hard work is the PRC panel. And they don't attend the meeting per se. Of course, they're welcome to observe, but they do help out and do an equal share of the assessment work that the committee undertake. And again, we seek specialisms, different grades of membership throughout those members. And then we have a separate pool of EngTech assessors as well, who review all of those EngTech applications that come through. And again, we want people for these groups who have that personal knowledge to inform their decision-making, well, recommendations, as we say. The assessors don't make a final decision, they recommend, the professional review committee ratify, and theoretically the qualification and membership board make the final decision, but certainly the PRC does the heavy lifting. And then, of course, the professional review interviewers I've mentioned, we've got about 700 or so across the UK and internationally. And we do quite a lot of training activity around that as well. And something that is unique to the institution across the 38 or so that we've got is the role of interview facilitator. And these are experienced interviewers who have then graduated, for want of a better word, and I see we've got a couple on the session today, who are in the room virtually now, pre-pandemic, of course, literally in the room, and they're ensuring that the process is followed correctly. Because again, going back to that number of almost 2,800 plus, that is a lot of assessment work going on, and we do need to ensure that we're maintaining that excellent standard that we're known for. And the facilitator is very much there to help ensure that, They support the applicant, they tell them what to expect. They're also there to support the panel, provide guidance as necessary, and to ensure that everything process-wise is being met. And then finally, another group you may not be aware of are our industrial advisors, and that's because they have always done assessments from home, paper-based assessments, but we have about almost 100 of them. And the lion's share of what they do is fellow applications. So again, they will be fellows themselves. So of course, it's about peer review, and they review the majority of fellow applications that come through, but they also look at existing registrants and mutual recognition agreements applications as well that come through. So again, doing those and again, passing them on to the professional review committee for final ratification. Just going to open it up to Steve. Anything you'd like to add? Anything I've missed with those roles?
Not really, Donovan. I think you've covered the gist of it. Just kind of one thing in terms of the specific EngTech assessors, we have now managed to merge them with the panel members of the PRC, so they don't exist as a separate group anymore. They're part and parcel of it. And the panel members, we do work quite hard to make sure they feel part of the team, so we always have a catch-up date, which is coming up actually this November, and we've tried to get as many of them as possible down to headquarters so they can actually join us around the table, and I think most of them seem to enjoy that. It kind of calibrates everyone's expectations, and although there is a theoretical limit on the numbers of people we'd bring into the room, we've never actually hit it yet. So anybody who wishes to come along to the November day is very welcome to do so, and it's good to get them along.
And is that the first in-person away day since before the pandemic?
We did manage it last year, so so this will be the second since pandemic.
Perfect. No, and again, from ones that I've witnessed in the past, it's as you say, a great opportunity to just get people in the room.
Yes.
Meet each other, find out, and learn from each other, just sort of see all the work that's been done. And I think there is also, as one of our registration committees, I think there is an open invitation from the Professional Review Committee that if you do wish to observe a meeting, you are welcome to do so. Again, limited by numbers. And certainly a lot of our assessors take advantage of that, and have done more so as we've encouraged it over the last few years to see exactly how that process works.
Absolutely, Donovan. And in fact, we always reserve 2 places at each meeting for observers, and they are generally speaking taken up. So we do account for people to come along and observe. There's a little bit of a waiting list, but it's good to see people come along. And it's also, if I'm honest, one of the main ways in which we ensure a bit of succession planning, because of course we're sounding people out to take up a role on the committee in due course if they're so amenable.
And who's the best person to contact to get on that waiting list?
Any of the vice chairs, or we're currently in the process of changing chairmanship from Penny Taylor to Tim Bagnall. But if you dropped a line to any of those, then we'd make the necessary arrangements.
And what I will be doing is providing a generic staff email as well at the end of this. So again, we can pass on details as well. So thank you, Steve. So then just looking at the process, and I've tried to simplify it, and Steve will correct me if I've made any mistakes or left something out, but this is just to give you an idea of how it all works. And if we start at the top there, staff checks, and that is everything from those academics I mentioned. So again, they facilitate going through academic review, CLA, etc., and everything that comes through, they check, make sure it's all there, they check sponsors. We also have consultant engineers looking at whether there is sufficient information in the application to move forward. Because again, if you just literally throw an application over the wall and it's absolute garbage and you have no chance of succeeding at interview, we don't want to put somebody through that experience. So again, we've got all these checks in place at that staff level. And then of course it goes on to the assessors, and quite a lot of stuff going on there. So I will ask Steve to talk through the EngTech process first, if you don't mind, as we pass on to those EngTech assessors.
Sure, no problem, Donovan. Yeah, the EngTech one is fairly simple because it doesn't necessarily require a PRI interview. Having said that, we do occasionally do a PRI interview, but generally not for EngTech. So what will happen is that an application comes through. Depending upon the route, the PRC pair will review that application. The amount of scoring and assessing they have to do varies a little. So they may have to assess all 5 competencies A to E for an individual or standard route application. If they're doing an approved route, they generally speaking only have to assess against competence E, specifically around CPD and code of conduct, effectively. If it's an armed forces SAP arrangement, then it's an even lighter touch than that, and basically they're just checking that the correct process has been followed and the correct endorsement has been made. So the EngTech process is fairly similar, but it is a little bit variable depending on the exact route that's being followed by the applicant.
Oh, thank you for that. I was a little bit unsure whether or not I should put in that sort of dotted line arrow into the interview process, because I think it happens very, very seldom.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I've been vice chair for EngTech now for I think 3 or 4 years, and in my time, we haven't put a single applicant through interview. So yeah, it's quite a rare event.
So then jumping over to the IMechE and CEng route, and of course, Engineering Council requires that new registrants must go through interview, no exceptions, as we've discussed. And for that panel, we've got our 2 interviewers and our facilitator. We don't industry match, apart from armed forces, which is very, very specialized, and at least one panel member has to be. We don't industry match because it's always been about engineering. It's never been, automotive, railway, power, etc. It's purely mechanical. It's about that conversation between peers, is what we've always called it, and being able to converse between the applicant and the panel to look at their experience and look at, their technical, their non-technical, all that good stuff. And it's a fairly rigorous process, but in an enjoyable way, I think is probably the best way of putting it. And certainly the feedback we get from applicants reflects that. And they go, some people are expecting it to be easy. They'll just walk into a room, get a couple of nods from 2 engineers, and that would be it. Definitely not. It is quite a thorough go through, but not in a sort of gotcha kind of way, of going through what they've done over the last 5 more years to meet those competence requirements and go in depth. And certainly an interesting process on both sides of the table there. What happens after that is that paperwork gets sent back to HQ, which is, of course, I am currently at HQ, the building, One Birdcage Walk, but of course we're all working from home most of the time now, spread across the country. And what we will do is we will batch them up and send them to the PRC. And there's an online hub that facilitates this because, again, there are so many. It also keeps all the information safe. And they will look at things in batches of anything from 10 or more applications at a time, usually more as the year goes by. And certainly that away day that Steve mentioned at the end of the year is also a catch-up day. It's an opportunity to get through as many applications as we can that build up over the year before the cut-off date with the Engineering Council for new registrants each year. And if you don't know, we have achieved the highest number of new registrants year on year for 10 years straight now. And again, a lot of that is down to this process, which works very, very smoothly, not just rigorously in terms of applying the standards, but also very smoothly in terms of, getting things through and avoiding bottlenecks. So those lists, as they are commonly referred to, those lists of applications, they go through to a pair. And that's where a member of the committee and a panel member as well get together, and they'll review them. They'll look at that interview paperwork, they'll look at the application, and 99 times out of 100, they will go, that looks good, we will ratify that. It's only in rare cases where they would disagree, and I'll get to that in a moment, and their processes in place for that. But most of the time, they trust the interviewers, and so they should. They look at it, everything appears to be in order, and they ratify. And then that goes to one of the deputy chairs So as I say, we've got one for iEng and two for cEng, and they will look at every single application that comes through as well. So if you look at that central strand, if you include the sort of consultant engineer having a look at the beginning, 3 people on the panel, interviewers plus facilitator, the PRC pair, and the vice chair, that is 7 assessors in total will look at a single application. It doesn't get more rigorous than that. And again, that same rigor happens with EngTech, and of course, Steve will see all of them as they come through from his assessors. They'll go across his virtual desk to have a look at. And then, of course, what happens if there is something at odds, or they don't perhaps agree as a pair, or the vice chair might have some concerns. It might be a bit of a challenging case, sort of borderline, I think is the word used. And if those scores that are awarded for competences are in any way ambiguous, if the comments don't support, and all these sort of things happen, then it can go through to one of those quarterly meetings. That said, very, very few do. So out of those, so a couple of thousand plus that happen, on average, we have 15 to 25 discussed cases at those quarterly meetings. And I won't say more than that, because I think Steve will probably give a much better description and describe exactly how that all works. So I'll just run through the fellow process quickly, and then I'll hand over to Steve to give you an insight into that process and how well it works, without stealing too many sandwiches from the picnic basket. So finally, just looking at fellowship, again, that comes through. Many of them are paper-based assessment that gets completed, and the qualities of fellowship, as we call them, entirely the gift of the institution, not governed by Engineering Council. So most of the time they go through without need of interview. However, industrial advisor and PRC can request an interview. And of course, that goes into the interviewer pool, 2 interviewers and a facilitator. And they'll look particularly at the areas where they were concerned, the qualities that were of concern. But again, they go through another deputy chair for all of our fellows as well. And again, across that board for EngTech, iEng, cEng, and fellows, it's only the odd cases, the challenging cases, that would go through to that quarterly PRC meeting in order to be discussed. But Steve, I'm very keen that you give people an insight into the sort of process and rigor of that. So I'll hand back to you.
Yes. Okay. Thanks. Thanks, Donovan. Yeah, I think as you mentioned, the default expectation when a case comes through effectively from PRI is that the PRC will agree with the PRI chair's recommendations. That's an expectation in the loosest sense of the word. Mostly we do actually, but there are cases where we do not, and it can go either way. So if a panel is recommending for election, for example, there may be some concerns from the PRC over some aspects of it that may require some further information, may require a re-interview at the end of the day. So that does happen in a very, very small number of cases. What perhaps happens in a larger number of cases is where the PRI are recommending to defer or to not recommend. And what the PRC pair will do then is spend a little bit of time just ensuring that there are no fundamental process issues with the conduction of the interview. So, for example, one of the things we're quite hot on these days is ensuring the candidates get a fair crack of the whip in getting 45 to 60 minutes for their PRI. If their interview time is short, for example, that can start to create a problem. Now, one of the things the PRC rather cannot do is overturn a not recommend decision to election. We cannot do that. The basis of election must always be the PRI. So someone must have seen the whites of the eyes of the applicant, must have spoken to them face to face, and must make the recommendation on the basis of that PRI. So the PRC have not been in that position. We haven't met the candidate face to face. So the worst, if I can express it that way, the worst that the PRC members can do is insist on a second interview. So that does happen. Again, it's in a very small minority of cases. I see someone asked a few moments ago about success rates for first interviews, which I can't actually give you the exact answer for that. But what I could tell you is that overall, the success rate is round about 91%. So the vast majority of people will go through based on their first interview. But of those that do not, some people obviously are so far of the mark, and the interview has been conducted in accordance with good practice, and effectively they'll end up as a not recommended or a deferral case. But there's another group of people who have gone through as not recommended, who will then undergo a second interview for whatever reason, and that actually has a surprisingly good pass rate. People who go to second interviews, we have a specialist group of people who conduct all of the second interviews. They're all based at headquarters at Birdcage Walk. So even if you've done an international interview, for the sake of argument, you wouldn't get a second interview with the international panel. You'd always get the second interview with the HQ specialists, in essence. So much of the debate that will take place around the table at each PRC meeting, and Donovan kind of said, typically maybe 12, 15 discusses cases per quarter. That was probably the case when I joined the PRC 10 or so years ago. It's probably half that now. It will be unusual to have 8 or 10 cases at PRC. 6 might be more typical. So we are talking a very small minority of cases. But the kinds of things we'll discuss is where a recommendation has been made to defer for the sake of argument, but there's lots and lots of good evidence in the written application and the comments made by the PRI team. Effectively, there's some problems with it. Maybe there's some inconsistency between the commentary and the marking. Maybe there's a big inconsistency between the chairman and the co-panelist. Those kinds of things would all be a flag to the PRC, and we would look in depth at that application. What exactly is the applicant claiming when he writes his narrative? What did the PRI panel see at the interview? How does it all mesh together? How does the paperwork fit in with it? And if we have any concerns, it's at that point there where we'll make a decision potentially to go through a second interview process for that applicant, and maybe give them another try. Effectively, if it's a process issue, we accept that it's the institution's fault, so we don't charge the applicant to resit that second interview. But effectively, they still have the stress and the pressure of going back around an interview process, which is not something that we take lightly. We know the pressure that people put themselves under on the run up to this kind of an interview process. So it isn't something we want to do lightly. It is something we do think about very carefully. So I don't know if that's sufficient detail, Donovan, or you'd like me to say anything more on that?
No, that's really good. Thank you. And yes, you've covered off the second interview process quite well, which I'll touch on briefly in the next slide. Yes, I think historically they've been HQ-based, London-based interviewers, because that's out of the hundreds and hundreds of interviews we do each year, probably about a quarter of them were done through HQ, through not just being London, but people wanted to come to London to get a date sooner. So they had, compared to some interviewers who maybe do 1 or 2 a year, those interviewers will have done, over the course of the last few years, 100, 150 in some cases. So they've got a lot of experience in that small group to ensure that we get it right the second time around. Because again, we are putting the applicant through that process again, rightly or wrongly. So, but yes, it's quite a rigorous process. So thank you. So then moving on to checks and balances, and just to provide a little bit of a surety about what happens in the process. Excuse me, just going to mute briefly. Murphy's Law throughout Steve's session is absolutely fine. And now that I need to talk, my voice has suddenly decided to depart. I think we're good. So, mechanisms in place to protect the process. A lot going on at various levels. So, as I said previously, we've got 7 people. Okay. Oh, I'm going to ask you to take over, Steve. Sorry. I'm just going to turn my camera off, have a very good coughing fit, and then I'll be back if you don't mind. Over to you, Steve, if you don't mind.
Okay, no problem at all.
Thank you.
No problem at all, Donovan. It's just, yes, do have a drink of water and yes, relax your voice for a second. So yeah, in terms of checks and balances, as the comment is made there on the slide, there's numerous assessors get to see an applicant as we go through the process. It does depend exactly what the process is, but yeah, around 7 different pairs of eyes will see an application before it's finalised. So there's lots of room for disagreement and dialogue and discussion on that. And if anyone is concerned at any stage of that process, they can refer it to full discussion at PRC. So this is the quarterly meeting, round the table discussion that we do reserve for the more controversial cases. The PRC can request the second interview wherever we feel that that's of benefit. Again, it's used fairly sparingly, but it is something that, I don't know, if I had to put a number on it, perhaps 2 or 3 cases at every PRC meeting would be referred to a second interview. And there is, of course, independent arbitration process that any applicant can request arbitration. That is fairly rare, I have to say. On average, there's, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 arbitration cases per quarter.
Yeah, that's about right.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm back. Sorry about that.
Excellent. Good
Just
stuff.
had to pull myself towards myself, as they say. Thank you, Steve. So yes, arbitration. This is something that I think even Steve has a slightly outside view of, because they are completely independent of the PRC. So they're people who in the past have been very, very involved in various points. They've been interviewers, they may be on the PRC. And it's a small group who, if an applicant comes forward, and if you go through that whole process, and PRC's missed it, and said, not sent to the second interview, and all these things have happened, you can come forward and go, look, I think I've been done wrong. And I think overall, over the course of last year, I think we only had 11 cases overall, of which 6 resulted in an overturn, as we say, i.e. somebody who's been unsuccessful gets sent to a second interview. And again, just as with the PRC, you cannot, the arbitration panel doesn't have the power to go, well, we've not met this person face to face, but we're going to decide to elect them. It has to go back to an interview panel. And again, we use the same one as the PRC do, those very experienced people with those hundreds of interviews under their belt, and they will assess, with a little bit of guidance to go, look, let's do this properly the second time round. So yes, 6 overturns out of 11 over the course of last year. So a tiny number out of those, again, over 2,800, which says that what the PRC does and what the interviewers do at the front half is done very, very well, which is really, really good to know. And then finally, the QMB has, as I said, that audit committee, and they certainly were the bane of my existence when I was in the membership development accreditation department, because they would pop up at inopportune times. And of course, they give us weeks and weeks of notice, but it would always still be a surprise on the day. And they'd sit down with us as members of staff, other volunteers, and go through and make sure that our processes are rigorous, that meet the requirements, and all that sort of paperwork that happens in the background. And then finally, the Engineering Council license reviews. We go through a massive one every 5 years. I've been through 2. And they are a large undertaking. And again, volunteers participate in that. We as staff, we prepare and help, submit examples of applications. They do spot checks. They go, can we see these applications? We want to, look at all the paperwork involved, make sure you're doing it properly. But then they meet with the chair of the Professional Review Committee, chair of the QMB, chair of the Academic Assessment Committee, and they meet with them, and it's quite a rigorous process to ensure that we're doing what we're doing properly to meet all those licenses that we have to accredit company schemes, to register EngTechs, incorporated chartered engineers, to approve and those EngTech schemes and all this stuff, the academics, university degrees, all of that is looked at in a lot of detail every 5 years. But annually, at the end of the year, we also have to submit a lot of statistics as well to ensure and give them some examples of what we're doing. So we've got that oversight as well. So final slide then. And then, of course, we'll open up to questions, slightly over time, but still within the hour. Recruitment and support, definitely if you want to get involved. There is so much happening. You know, we're always looking for interviewers, EngTech assessors, industrial advisors. And again, the PRC panel and PRC committee, it's very much a succession journey. Typically, interviewers will join the panel, advisors will join the panel members will then join the committee, but we do sometimes jump the queue if we're looking for specialists as well. And again, because of the terms of reference of the committee, we don't have people staying on endlessly anymore. We do have very fixed terms for not just the chairs and vice chairs, but ordinary members and panel members. And it's that balance between not just getting rid of all of your good knowledge and expertise at once, but year on year just replacing a couple of people and getting in fresh blood as well to get those new perspectives, but also that massive knowledge base in the middle. And then training. We do a lot of training for each of those groups, and particularly the interviewers. I think we've done over 30 training sessions virtually this year for interviewers. So a lot of support out there to help you get started on this journey. And certainly if you're interested, assessor training at IMechE.org. I've got some amazing colleagues who work in that team who will be able to give you more information. Other than that, any closing remarks from you, Steve? And I'm just going to have a quick glance to see if we've got some questions.
Nothing really for me to say. I think I've mentioned everything that I set out to do, Donovan. So yeah, happy to see if there's any relevant questions that we can look at.
So what is the success rate? Yes, we did. Steve, I think, answered that. It's on average about 91% overall. Higher or lower in some regions, some areas, but overall it's in the healthy range as an institution compared to others as well. Is there published criteria of requirements for CEng registration in terms of what experience an applicant has? Short answer, yes. What I would direct you to have a look at is the guidance material we issue with the application itself. At the end of that, it's about 27 pages long. And then plus some extra bits, it does give very broad examples of the types of activities we'd expect to see for each competence. And that's a good launch pad. We also have industrial profiles. So you would also look at what a typical automotive engineer would look like, aerospace, etc. And we've got those on the website as well. And I'll try and dig those out if I can. And send a link. If not, assessor training, they'll have those as well. Run through the score process for CEng. Oh, I will do this very quickly, so pay attention. 5 areas of UK spec, each gets a score between 1 to 4. In order to pass, you need to achieve 2 2s and 3 3s. Any one in any competence area is an automatic deferral, or not recommend, unsuccessful. So you do need minimum of 2 2s and 3 level 3s across any of the competences. Those 3s can be in the non-technical with the 2s in the technical. I think many years ago, even before I joined, you'd have to get those higher scores in the technical. That's no longer the case. Those who are into more leadership roles, technical leadership as well, etc. Again, higher scores there, absolutely fine. So that's a whistle stop of the competence scoring. Latest figures for virtual PRI success rates compared with previous face-to-face interviews. Negligible, not really. Again, the interview itself has worked quite well, and those deferral rates, etc., exactly the same as they have always been. And then final long question there from David. Now that we have largely transferred entirely to virtual, is there a case for the chair and or to be invited to provide input to the quarterly PRC in the event of disagreement? I don't know. I'm sure there's a very good reason why we would or would not. I will give that one to Steve to take away. and ask the committee, but no plans that I am aware of right now. Is there a chance of an indication of likely PRC review date being included in the info sent out to PRI teams? Yes, I don't see any issue with that. I don't know them off the top of my head, not working with them anymore. But yes, we'll see if we can do that.
Sorry, Donovan, I think that's possibly already done. And in fact,
Thank
the
you.
interview facilitator usually will brief the candidate. I'm not sure they brief the PRI panel, but they certainly brief the candidate on when the next PRC meeting is, which is usually the outside date by which they should have heard.
Thank you. Do interviewers know if an applicant has come in by MPDS? Yes. It will say MPDS on the actual application paperwork somewhere. They'll still provide evidence against all the UK spec areas, but yes, it will say MPDS, but no special consideration is given. We also no longer have mentors as part of the PRI process, so it's all fairly straightforward. Oh, Howard has asked, what criteria for academic review, as I've encountered candidates with civil engineering degrees and backgrounds? Too complex to go into now, or even if I had a 45-hour session. What I would say is, don't let it worry you. Trust the academic assessment committee. So if you have someone who has more of a civil background, be assured they've met the academic requirements, and what your focus is then on is looking at their competence and the definition of mechanical engineering, looking for those mechanical elements in their technical experience. So that's what you're going to be looking for. But I know it's quite easy to sort of think, oh, the academics don't quite line up. Don't worry. Don't worry about it. Trust the committee. They know, they've definitely given it a rigorous going around. So again, interview is just about competence. Can we share a typical PRI report? Yes and no. If you are an interviewer and you've attended training, we do case study work within that. And part of that process is looking at very real cases, redacted, of course, confidential and sensitive information, but you can see comments from the chair and co-panelists, the interview facilitator as well. So yes, if you join one of those sessions, become an interviewer, you definitely get that. What will be the interview cutoff date being elected? Oh, probably early mid-October, but do not quote me on that. Essentially, PRC's final meeting is the middle to late November, and that engineering cutoff date is very late November, very early December. So again, it's just getting in that line. So I'd say after mid-October, your chances are not that great. So again, that's a rough finger in the wind, but we don't have an exact date. What will be the future of the interviews, virtual or PRI? Very much virtual for now. I think we've adapted quite well. We can reach a lot of people, but certainly something we'll review year on year. And that'll be done between the Professional Review Committee, consulting the assessors as well, and working on the best way for the applicant as well. I think it's the viewpoint of what makes it easiest for the applicant as well is a big consideration in that. And then Steve has answered that one. And then finally, I think I'm quite happy to continue answering questions if Steve is. Are the sponsors for the applicant scored by the PRI? No. So sponsors, I have very mixed feelings about sponsors. But sponsors are people who know the applicant, who are willing to endorse the application essentially and say, look, I think this person's got what it takes. Beyond that, don't worry about them. Somebody has found 2 engineers somewhere who's willing to endorse them, and that is the end of the story. Evaluate them on the merit of what they give you at the interview. Whether their sponsor is somebody very, very big and important, or somebody you've never heard of, doesn't really matter. It's about what they demonstrate in the application and what they're able to talk about at the interview. So. Can you share some unsuccessful cases of application? That also happens at training. So training, those case studies, there's a selection of them. And it's, again, looking at that. I don't know, Steve, if you can describe what an unsuccessful case would look like in a minute or less.
I would say the main, probably the only reason for deferral is where an applicant has not been able to establish their competence across a number of the competence areas. So, for example, they'll be subject to a bit of probing by a panel, even if their narrative is a little bit inadequate. So they'll be probed and pressed and pushed for evidence in specific areas. And if they're unable to come up with a credible answer, that is most likely what's going to result in a deferral. And I have to say, I think most people have probably been around long enough to know now that sometimes you'll see the most fantastic written narrative submission and then a very, very poor face-to-face presentation at PRI. And equally, you can see a very, very poor narrative submission and an absolutely brilliant face-to-face demonstration at PRI. So sometimes tallying the two together, it can be a little bit of a challenge. Sometimes candidates fall flat on their face and dry up, and no matter how much probing and prodding and assistance they can be given by a panel, sometimes it's not enough. So the onus is very much on the applicant to establish their competence to the required extent.
Indeed. I'm just looking at that last question. Reasons for deferral, there are many, but it's that not quite there yet. Essentially, as far as the applicant is concerned, they've not been successful. But in every single case, they will receive written guidance to say this is why you've been unsuccessful. And they're also encouraged to request a copy of their professional review report, that interview paperwork. Again, redacted, so they can't hunt down their assessors directly and go, why did you do this to me? But it will give those comments and some guidance for how they might want to reapply in the future and what areas they need to address. How long after CEng can a member be considered for PRI training? Immediately. It's about peer review. So if you're an IMechE or a CEng, once you achieve registration, you are qualified to then assess somebody else. And certainly having just been through the process, you are very aware of your own competence as well. So yes, we welcome people who have just registered as well. So please do. And again, if you are early career, it can be a bit challenging getting time off work, but we do now offer half days as well, not doing a full day of interviews. But certainly, yes, you would be eligible after attending training, of course. So we have hit just after past, so we've been online for an hour. So I will bring things to a close, and I will say a very big thank you to Steve for joining and providing us with your insights and expertise. So thank you very, very much. For everyone else, this will be available on recording. If you do have any more questions, I'm going to type in assessor training into the, well, actually, I'm not going to try and talk and do it. I can't talk and type at the same time. It's that time of day. Kirsty, if you don't mind just typing in assessor training at IMechE.org. The slides will also be available shortly after for everyone. You can go through those, but you can contact me. Again, I'm not directly involved in the process anymore. I'm process adjacent, but certainly happy if I can't help you, I can pass on your query as well. Otherwise, thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.